Good morning. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Maureen McCarthy. I'm the director of the National Security Forum, and I am very glad everybody is here. Today, we have a very interesting, super timely talk. Usually, we actually ask you to sit through nuclear strategies and nuclear policies and everybody's so oh okay, I have to listen to this again this year. But this year it's like one of the most timely topics in the news, and that's saying a lot right now. Unlike our usual programs, now you get to hear from me doing an introduction. For most of you who know me, I have a long history of working in nuclear proliferation, nonproliferation issues, and nuclear weapons issues from my time as the chief scientist for the National Nuclear Security Administration in Washington. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to this talk because Keith and I and Ray and John, when we were setting this up, we were discussing how to look at this problem, which is usually pretty gradual issues. But this year it's gone like off the charts. The big question that we need to ask and that we're going to address in this talk is, are we really ready for the next nuclear age? We're going to explain to you that we're already in the next nuclear age. So, ready or not, here it comes. There is a fabulous article that summarizes just about everything that we wanted to bring up today in Foreign Affairs, and it just came out on the 8th of March. You'll see some references and some articles. All of these have come out in the last few weeks. So this is a huge topic. And this is really talking about the risk that we're facing in terms of proliferation. We often refer to two sides of the issue: the civil side and the uncivil side. The civil side is what we call civil nuclear energy. That's nuclear energy production. So what you'll hear about a little bit is two things going on in the nuclear world. One is a huge growth in nuclear energy, and then the other uncivil side of nuclear energy is all about the nuclear weapons side. This is just a representation, just a few articles that have come out since January. There is an exceedingly rapid growth in nuclear energy. We haven't seen this before. And that's really going to change how we think about nuclear energy globally. It's going to change who has access to nuclear materials, because there are countries that are now surging their nuclear power. Countries that had walked away from nuclear power are now returning to it. India, China, North Korea, Europe, Japan, Africa, Southeast Asia, just about everywhere. But this is just meant to be a snapshot of nuclear power capacity under construction by region and origin of the technology. The dark blue line shows you the number of plants that are under construction and who the design is. So the dark blue are Chinese design, the light blue is Russian designs, and other, as you can see, is much smaller. Other is basically Western Europe designs, either the United States or France or others. So you can see that there's a big surge in growth. And this is where the proliferation comes in. Unlike previous eras when nuclear energy was developing, there were nuclear power plants that were Western developed, and then there was Russia. Now China's playing a huge role in this. And it shows you some of the countries that are in construction. This is just in construction. According to the World Nuclear Association, there are currently 30 countries right now considering planning or starting nuclear power programs. That's a lot of countries. They're from Europe, and you can see the list in Europe. They're not countries that you might have expected: Albania, Latvia, Lithuania, Ireland, places that we hadn't seen nuclear power programs before. Middle East and North Africa, there's a huge drive to really have stable sources of energy. So everywhere from Saudi Arabia to Iraq, Yemen, Israel, of course, Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, Algeria, not always countries that we think of as completely stable. Africa, again, Nigeria, Gambia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, not always the most stable areas. And then throughout the Americas, this is not including the United States on this slide, because we're a very small contributor to the building part, Central Asia, and in Asia. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the growth of nuclear energy. And a lot of this is being driven because there are designs from China that are readily available to a lot of those countries. Yes, the United States is in the game, kind of, sort of, not really. We haven't been for 30 years, but we did indeed commission two new reactors, one in 23 and one in 24. Those were the first nuclear reactors that we have commissioned in 30 years in the United States. So it tells you we're out of the design business and the deployment business. Both of those were at an existing nuclear power plant. And both of them are the old traditional pressurized water reactors. There's a lot of research going on from DOE in small modular reactors. There is testing of small modular reactors at the Idaho National Laboratory. And of course, Bill Gates is in the business. Bill Gates is supporting the building. They have cleared ground. They have put in some basic facilities in Wyoming for what would be the country's first commercial sodium-cooled fast reactor. A concept that also has been around for decades, but the United States basically walked away from deploying it ages ago. That's an interesting development because now you're seeing the private sector move into not only building, but actually being in the design part. Yeah, we're kind of sort of in the business, but, there are a lot of other folks who are doing a lot more than we are. In addition, as we bring the civil side of nuclear together with the uncivil side, we are looking at major shifts in policy. Nuclear issues last a long time. So we're talking decades of impact, what's happening now. Europe is revisiting nuclear power in countries that had shut it down, Germany, and France has always been in the business. Italy is also looking to get now into the business of having nuclear power. And after all of this, there's also arguments right now about the role of nuclear weapons in security. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. That's just to show you that it's coming at you from both sides, from the nuclear energy side, and now you'll hear from Keith about the nuclear weapons proliferation issues.
Thank you, Maureen. Appreciate being here with you and Rae and John. Let me just say, by way of introduction, the world community has been working for decades to try to put a cap on proliferation of nuclear weapons. Back in the early 60s, just 15 years after the advent of the nuclear age, Washington had concluded that within the next 10 to 15 years, it'd be over 20 countries with nuclear weapon arsenals. And that got people's attention that maybe we need to do something about that. So there are certain international activities that took place and creating what we call the nuclear weapon non-proliferation regime. It consisted primarily of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was negotiated in the late 60s. Most of the world's countries have joined. There are certain countries that have never joined. Some regions of the world, I think it's 5 of them, have agreed to have nuclear weapon-free zones. So there are no nuclear weapons permitted by the countries in those zones. And then there are certain treaties, other treaties that have been negotiated to ban testing, limit testing locations and such on, trying to put a tamper on potential for proliferation. But I have to say, El Baradei, who was head of the International Atomic Energy Agency back about 20 years ago, said, look, folks, there's the camel's head is under the tent. Once we allowed countries, even those who declare themselves to be non-nuclear weapon countries, if they have nuclear power plants and if they have the ability to enrich uranium and to create plutonium, we can't stop proliferation. It's there. All they have to do is make the decision to do it. More recently, in the 90s, we were very concerned about what happened after the collapse of the USSR, because the Soviet strategic nuclear arsenal now existed in 4 different independent countries: Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and, of course, in Russia. This was exceedingly concerning to people because the risks now of stuff escaping control and getting into the hands of either country proliferators or maybe even worse, into terrorists seem to increase dramatically. Currently, we're looking mostly at Iran, who seems to be on the verge of going nuclear if it chooses to. Israel is, by the estimation of most people, even though it's an undeclared nuclear weapons state. Saudi Arabia and Egypt have said, hey, if Iran goes, we go. And then you have China building up the biggest buildup of strategic nuclear arsenal of any country at the moment. And now you have South Korea and Japan looking at this as maybe something they need to do. And then you've got the terrorists out there, and the terrorists don't have the capability typically of building nuclear weapons, but they could steal them. They could steal fissile material and make a crude weapon. Or maybe one of these proliferating countries would even say, hey, why don't you take this weapon and go deploy it, and we'll have the ability to declare that we were not involved. But what about others? We're going to have to talk about that. This is not an exhaustive list. Let's talk about those former Soviet countries. As I said, the nuclear weapons facilities were located in many regions, all kinds of stuff spread all over the place. And keep in mind, as long as the Soviet Union and the Communist Party was in charge, the whole country was pretty much a jail. They had reasonable control over their borders. But once that overpressure of control from Moscow disappeared, they did not have the kinds of controls that we felt were important. And so there was very, very big concern on the part of us and our NATO allies and others that the chances were high that material, weapons, and expertise were going to disappear out of these countries and end up where the demand was the greatest. And at that point, it was Iran, it was North Korea, and some others. So that really trumped almost all U.S. concerns. And we'll talk about how that affected Ukraine, because Ukraine was the one of the four that was most hesitant, or the three non-Russian countries that was most hesitant to give up its nuclear arsenal. And we had overly optimistic expectation that Russia would now, post-USSR, would become a positive global player and that everything was going to be sweet and happy into the future. So there were some certain expectations here, which obviously have not turned out. Belarus first, just to tick these off, closely tied to Russia, and it agreed immediately in 91 to transport its stuff to Russia for storage, et cetera, et cetera. And it welcomed some U.S. assistance. We sent 700 emergency response teams to help the elimination of some of the weapon activities there. But last year, Russia began to threaten over Ukraine and say, well, maybe we have to send our weapons back into Belarus. So it's something to keep our eye on. Kazakhstan, again, like Belarus, was pretty eager to actually get rid of this stuff. They had suffered years of environmental damage from nuclear testing in Kazakhstan, blasting, and all kinds of stuff. And they basically said, we don't want to be responsible for this anymore. So they were very, very quick to transfer all their stuff to Russia. And they asked for U.S. assistance in doing that and getting rid of some of their highly enriched uranium. 600 kilograms were shipped to the Oak Ridge, Tennessee lab for storage and reprocessing. So Kazakhstan was another good story. Ukraine, okay. Well, Ukraine had the third largest arsenal in the world at the time it became independent. 44 strategic bombers, 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles. It had a big, big infrastructure. And its leadership was conflicted. Those leaders who early on were controlled by Moscow were happy to do something with Russia, but when they got kicked out and more nationalistic leadership came in, they were not so happy about that. And they actually claimed the ownership of their warheads that they had in country. Well, the rest of the world was leaning on Ukraine because of the concerns I mentioned to you earlier. So a number of meetings were held to try to figure out how do we convince Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. And I can remember being involved in Hansen a couple of national intelligence estimates saying, yeah, the Ukrainians are not interested in giving up their weapons, despite what the US government wants them to do. Finally, in 1994, assurances given, security assurances to Ukraine that their borders would be protected and their sovereignty would be respected. Well, we had the fox and the chicken pen because Russia was one of the three countries that gave those security assurances. So if you're sitting in Kiev today, ask yourself, do I trust any security guarantees from anybody outside of my country? That is a proliferation concern. Israel, I mentioned early in the 1960s, because it was surrounded by hostile neighbors and fought a number of wars against them, clandestinely developed its own nuclear arsenal. We discovered this. We were upset about it, we in the US. But Israel said, but are you going to come to our defense? Are you going to use your nuclear weapons to protect us? Does your nuclear umbrella really work for Israel in the middle of the Middle East? Well, the US kind of got cold feet, and finally, into President Nixon's administration, agreed that we would allow and not stop Israel from becoming nuclear weapons capable as long as they never, ever voiced this publicly that they had a nuclear arsenal. They have been very ambiguous about that. This has helped them because the uncertainty keeps some of their neighbors off balance, but it also feeds a neighbor like Iran with the justification for we need to have our own nuclear weapon program because we know Israel has it. And if Israel has it and we don't like Israel, we want to destroy Israel, we need to have our own nuclear weapons. In this context, there's no way that Israel is going to give up its clandestine, undeclared nuclear arsenal. Okay, let's talk about that US nuclear umbrella. One of the things we did in the 60s, as well as going into these treaties like the NPT and so on, was to say, look, friends, we have significant number of nuclear weapons. We've got you covered. We will protect you. This went from Europe all the way over to the Far East. So we gave, in a sense, security guarantees. We promoted the NPT, and we also deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Europe opposite the Warsaw Pact, which had overwhelming preponderance of conventional forces that if they came across, we'd use our nuclear weapons to defeat that. We took some steps here, which were pretty incredible, and our friends basically said, okay, we'll give up our nuclear weapon programs. And a number of these countries had nuclear weapon programs, not nuclear weapons, but they had programs, and they were in the process of going down that trail. Now, given what's happened in the recent weeks and months, some of those countries are beginning to question the credibility of the US nuclear umbrella. And that doesn't bode well. Okay, I talk about other countries. Iran mentioned. Saudi Arabia says if Iran gets them, we're going to get them. Egypt says if Iran gets them, we're going to get them. South Korea says, North Korea is much more of a challenge now than it used to be. And Japan, the only victim of nuclear warfare, is beginning to wonder whether they need to have their own nuclear arsenal. And then we have the non-state actor, either as surrogates or on their own, wanting to get nuclear material for their own purposes. But what about others? What about France? France has nuclear weapons, but what about Germany? It doesn't. But maybe it's going to cooperate with France. There's a lot of going on here, a lot of moving that is unpredictable at the moment and is kind of unsettling. So we talked about Iran. Yeah, okay. They want prestige, they want status, but they also want to deter Israel and they want to deter the US. The effort back in the Obama administration to sign an agreement to stop the program, at least delay the program, was not a very good agreement. It was only a temporary block. And finally, in his previous administration, President Trump decided to jump out of it. And now Iran's no longer abiding by it. And IAEA reports that, Iran is now in a breakout position. They are enriching their uranium way beyond what they need for peaceful use. And they seem to be in a similar position that India and Pakistan were in the late 1990s and North Korea was in the early 2000s. It won't take much for Iran to move to become a nuclear weapons state. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, I talked about. Part of this is the Shia-Sunni competition. Yes, the Pakistanis have a nuclear arsenal, but it's a South Asian issue. It's not a Middle East issue. And they are a Sunni, yes, but now the Shias, in their competition with the Sunnis, do not have a country that has nuclear weapons. So that's part of what's motivating here. China, I already mentioned, has got one of the largest growing nuclear and conventional military arsenals of any country in the world. It's just going gangbusters. Now, you got to keep in mind, back in the 90s, when we were negotiating the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, we asked China, you should join us in nuclear arms control. And at that point, we estimate China had maybe about 500 warheads, and the US and Russia were in the thousands. And China said, hey guys, when you're reduced to our level, come and talk to us. Maybe we'll think about it. Well, maybe they've decided not to think about it anymore. Maybe they decided to build up to meet whatever Russia and China have at the moment, capped at around 1,500 nuclear warheads. So we'll have to see what happens. Now, keep in mind, China is important because it's the only country that seems to have any influence on North Korea. But North Korea is very useful to it in keeping the US off balance and keeping other countries in the region a little bit unsettled. But I don't think Beijing would want Kim to do something stupid because that could risk China's interests directly. The growing North Korean threat. Yes, there it is. Kim keeps saying we're going to build more, build better, build longer missiles, et cetera, et cetera. And keep in mind, he was one of those countries that benefited from the AQ-CON black market network back in the 90s, along with Iran, Libya, Syria, and others. AQ-CON, who was the father of the Pakistani nuclear program, was cashing in big time and selling material, shipping material, and so on. North Korea benefited from that, and North Korea has been playing denuclearization games with us for decades now. We tried in the 90s, tried in the early 2000s, 2010s to do something about North Korea. Trump even tried to do a personal thing, obviously. But North Korea says, hey, we're surrounded by people who don't like us. We want to deter the US because we don't trust the US. So there we are. Go have a nice day. South Korea and Japan, I mentioned briefly already. South Korea had a nuclear weapon program at one time because of the US nuclear umbrella. They decided to back off, but they're now questioning US reliability. And Japan, as I mentioned, it's concerned about a very threatening North Korea. Historical relations with China are not exactly good. And is the US reliable? Another question that's being asked. So we've got a real problem on our hands. Non-state actors, of course, got a big job. They don't have the infrastructure to build nuclear weapons or to deliver them very well with bombers or missiles. They can do some damage. Just think what the World Trade Center would have looked like if those 767s had had fissile material included with the fuel that got spread out. Then Manhattan would have been contaminated to a considerable degree. These terrorists, they could be an agent for one of these other countries that doesn't want to have their fingers on the pulse except to supply the material and benefit from the damage caused. So Europe, okay, France has always been suspicious of the US. That's even after the 1950s and early 60s when Charles de Gaulle wanted to create the force de frappe for France because he didn't trust the US nuclear umbrella. Says we got to have our own. Well, that feeling seems to be slipping into Poland, the Balkan states. What about the UK, our very, very close ally, with whom we've traded all of our secrets for nuclear weapons and so on? But what's going to be our relationship with London? Does the UK have to now move closer to France and maybe work with them to provide some kind of a nuclear umbrella for Europe by Europeans? So what's the future of NATO in all this? Is the US losing its influence? Are we playing into the hands of Putin's desire to decouple European security from US security? John and I worked very closely in the 1980s in the INF negotiation, which was the Soviet goal at that time, through deployment of SS-20s to decouple European security from US security. We stood up to the plate and we dealt with that successfully, fortunately. But I wonder if we're back in that game again. So here we are. We appear to have escaped the problems of the former Soviet countries having nuclear arms, but we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what actually did escape. And I know we caught some stuff en route trying to leave, but what did we not catch? That's the concern we have. And will our non-proliferation measures, those international ones and the national ones, are they going to be successful? Or is the U.S. influence going to be weakened enough that this just actually increases the risk of proliferation? And for sure, don't be surprised if you wake up one morning and Iran has exploded a nuclear bomb. I think it's almost a sure thing, and we're going to have to get used to the fact that Iran's going to be a nuclear weapons state. Who else? That's what we don't know. Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Rae to talk a little bit, bringing those two pieces together of the civil and uncivil side of nuclear energy.
Well, you've heard in the background statements here that there are spreading interests in building nuclear power plants. And one of the reasons that's of interest to proliferation is because virtually all nuclear weapons programs have derived from large nuclear reactor programs built to generate electricity. And I want to raise just two questions here for our purposes this morning and take a look at first, what does it take, in effect, if a country does not have a nuclear power plant to build one and move into production of weapons materials? And secondly, what do the timelines look like? Today we have large complexes that have nuclear power plants, and we have a lot of countries who are interested in it, but who have not yet built any. How much time is involved in getting from the planning stage, in effect, to a nuclear weapon? So I want to look here first, just to give you a reminder that in the EU, countries in dark blue here already have extensive nuclear power plant functions, and they are also, at least France, nuclear power. The extent to which they've built nuclear power generating capabilities is surprising. The second thing is the nuclear power generation in other countries. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of how many countries are relying on nuclear power, but I'm going to give you some key numbers, so brace yourselves, because the most interesting thing is the number of reactors that these countries have, not necessarily the proportion of their electricity that they're generating, but the impetus to build more nuclear power generating plants will come from those large countries that have nuclear reactors, but have only a small portion of their electrical grid generated from reactors. So the United Kingdom has 9 reactors, Russia has 17, China has 55, and is the third largest power producer in the world after the US and France. The US produces 18% of its electricity from 94 reactors, so we're the largest, and that's more than 1.5 times the number that France or China has, but it's declining after the 3 Mile Island accident. South Korea has 23 reactors. That's a lot. Japan produced 30% of its power from reactors until the accident at Fukushima. And following that, it shut down its nuclear power plants until they could be relicensed. Today, 14 plants have been restarted and 11 are in process, and Japan hopes to generate 40% of its power from nuclear sources by 2020. Once a country has a nuclear reactor, it can enrich its uranium fuel to weapons-grade materials. It's not simple, especially with the international safeguards designed to present it, but the process looks something like this. Raw ore contains about 0.1% uranium-235, which is enriched to a concentration of about 3 to 5% to serve as a nuclear fuel. There are 2 commercial enrichment processes used to do this: gaseous diffusion and gas centrifugation. This figure here shows a schematic of both processes, and on the right, what we have is gaseous diffusion, which combines fluorine with uranium to form a gas, which is then forced through tiny membranes to separate enriched 238 isotopes from the lighter 235 isotopes. Now, this process uses massive amounts of electricity and is considered obsolete. Also shown is the more modern gas centrifuge, which rotates at high speeds, forcing the heavier molecules to the outside of the cylinder where they're collected. Parallel series of centrifuges, shown in this slide, are used to continue the enrichment process, and nuclear weapons usually require uranium enriched to 85% or more. And so these centrifuges are used in series. The growing world demand for electricity from nuclear-powered reactors will complicate an already difficult process of arms control. The good news is that only a few countries, Iraq, some EU countries, and South Korea, have the capacity to make much progress over the next dozen years. Japan has the technical ability to proceed, but it faces popular political prohibitions that will be hard to overcome. In general, it takes a decade or more to build a facility. Egypt, for example, contracted with Russia to build a nuclear power facility in 2022 after years of negotiations, and it hopes to have that completed by 2031. New technology in the form of small modular reactions is getting a lot of interest, and there are some 80 designs for generating electricity, steam for industrial applications, and water salinization. Designers hope to bring the technology to fruition this decade and manufacture modular parts in factories. As of today, small modular reactions operate only in Russia and in China, although Argentina has one under construction. And these reactors, too, can produce fissile materials. Additional accelerants to the demand for nuclear weapons have arisen as a result of the North Korean ICBM program. It raised doubts in Asia as to whether the U.S. would honor its security commitments at the price of an attack on its own territory. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine undermined the existing security calculus when Ukraine's nuclear-armed guarantors, as Keith mentioned, the U.S. and the UK and Russia, refused direct military engagement with Russia, the nuclear-armed aggressor. If you want to know how far the nuclear umbrella extends, my view would be that it extends to the extent of the nuclear power, and it doesn't really prevent invasions of non-nuclear powers. But it raises the questions all over the world. Anti-nuclear remarks by President Trump have led to security reviews in Europe, and you heard Macron's speech as a part of that, offering to use the French nuclear umbrella on behalf of NATO. And these new geopolitical developments will hasten additional countries to pursue the national nuclear deterrent, as well as augmented conventional military capabilities. Given its war experience, will the Ukraine choose to develop nuclear weapons secretly to use as a deterrent for its future security? It has the seventh largest nuclear power complex in the world and generates half of its electricity from 15 reactors. They've been damaged and repaired during the course of the conflict, and it's not clear what's going to be left when a ceasefire is finally signed. But the Ukraine has both the infrastructure and the technical skill base to produce weapons-grade materials, as well as long-range aircraft and long-range missiles, if they choose to do so and place them in their inventory, because that's what they did during the time of the Soviet Union. Attempts to control nuclear weapons proliferation in the future are likely to run aground against growing beliefs that a national nuclear deterrent is an existential requirement to complement a capable conventional defense in the face of nuclear invaders with huge conventional capabilities. And here you think Russia and its neighbors, China and its neighbors, perhaps even North Korea and its neighbors. And I judge the first countries to proceed with further proliferation will be Iran and South Korea. And those will be a focus, I'm sure, for the diplomats working this problem. And they probably have a window of a dozen years or more between those countries and other countries, except for the EU, other countries in the world who are still trying to acquire nuclear reactors and begin nuclear electricity programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers. So we have an excellent panel to answer questions. On our panel, in addition to Keith and Rae, we also had John Woodworth, who you've heard from before, who, as Keith mentioned, he worked with in the 80s. John has a long history of working these issues with NATO, and so NATO questions will go to John. We also have Tom Carey. Tom is a colleague from Desert Research Institute who specializes in nuclear nonproliferation, and he's coming to us from Vegas. So we've got lots of people to field your questions. I'm going to ask Keith, you mentioned the AQCon network. For those in the audience who are maybe not quite as old as we are, would you remind them what the AQCon network was and how that essentially was a proliferation accelerant? And what counters do we have for that kind of proliferation issues now?
Historically, we were watching, obviously, big structures. We followed shipments of things from countries and suspected proliferators. That is, out of countries that had stuff that we knew they could give away. What AQ Khan did was, after he got the Pakistani nuclear program off the ground, he decided, hey, there was money to be made. So he was now clandestinely shipping stuff from one source to a demand and doing it, under false flag umbrellas and everything on the shipping. The U.S. finally, in part because of Libya, we found a ship that was supposedly shipping, I've forgotten what it was, some kind of domestic stuff. And we stopped it on the high seas. And guess what? It had all the markings of a nuclear weapons proliferation infrastructure that was being shipped to Libya. Once we discovered that, then we went to Gaddafi and said, okay, I think we got you now. And he gave up. He wanted to get out of the business. He didn't want to have happen to him what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So he then confessed what was going on. That led us to go back and look at other places where the AQ Khan black market network had been working, North Korea, et cetera, and Iran. And we discovered and finally called Pakistan to task. You've got to stop this guy. We basically shut down that black market network, but the damage had already been done. So this raises the question, how do you detect and how do you stop small clandestine nuclear proliferation activities? Well, it comes down to having good intelligence and being able to get agents in various places where you think the proliferation is taking place or to be received. You also start tracking financial flows through the international financial community to find out who's paying whom what, because a lot of money gets passed in for all this kind of stuff. So there's no silver bullet, but it does take a lot of cooperation on the part of countries that are committed to stopping such proliferation, to work together, to share information and so on. But it just takes a few bad actors who are very creative, and no matter where you put the bar, they figure out some way to get over it. So it's a problem that we face. At least we've been alerted to this other avenue of proliferation now, which we were pretty much ignorant of beforehand, and realize it's a vulnerability we have globally, and we have to pay attention to it as best we can.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question of Rae. You mentioned that countries who have the basic capabilities and resources can create a nuclear program. Can you explain more specifically what those basic capabilities and resources are?
Well, most of them are technical, but if you can build and operate a reactor, then you'll have the engineering and scientific expertise basically to produce the nuclear level fissionable materials. It takes a lot of electricity to begin producing this stuff. You also have to maintain security around it. And if you recall the Iranian example, they were heavily defended by air defenses. They built the centrifuge farms in underground areas and so forth. So it's more than just having a room off the back of the reactor building. You do have to have considerable facilities to transmit electric power, to probably bury the centrifuge farms. And you've got to have, depend on whether you want to keep it secret or not, as everybody seems to try to do, you've got to have, in effect, a large security infrastructure. Now, once you get fissionable materials, you still don't have a nuclear weapon. There are a lot of steps before you can get a nuclear weapon out of your own territory. You can always blow it up in the backyard, but the fact of the matter is if you want to attack an enemy, you have to have a delivery vehicle. And getting a delivery vehicle that will get through modern air defenses today is not easy. So you can either buy it from some cooperative country or you make it yourself. But if you try to make it yourself and adapt some sort of existing on-the-market missile, it's a large step to get a nuclear warhead which will actually hit a target and explode rather than fail in the process. This is not easy. This is very difficult, and it requires specialized materials, specialized engineering, and it requires, in effect, specialized manufacturing facilities. And in addition to that, you need a test program, which is usually the tip-off to anybody who doesn't know that you have fissile materials. And you've got to have engineers, in effect, that can work with specialized materials.
Excellent. Thank you, Rae. John, I'm going to send this one to you. How credible is a nuclear umbrella offered by France and or the UK? And what type of delivery systems would they use in order to implement that umbrella?
To some degree, extended deterrence is by its nature almost impossible to know with certainty what will happen under any given circumstance. What would France or what would the UK do? The UK has always linked its strategic deterrent to NATO, and it has never had to define exactly what that means. In the same sense that the United States never has been able to define exactly when it would use nuclear weapons. It would always depend on circumstances, and frankly, it would always depend on who was in the leadership position in the United States, because only the president can make that decision. And I think, as we all know, our leaders have had different dispositions toward these weapons during different times. And this has prompted this very large ongoing debate now in Europe, led by France, but carried out by other countries as well, as to what to do in a circumstance in which they begin not to trust the U.S. nuclear guarantee. This is an unforced error on our part, the weakening of our extended deterrence, because this has a critical place to play in proliferation issues, and not just in Europe or in Asia with our close allies there, but it has reverberations around the world, because what other countries do will have an effect. President Macron, in his speech a couple of weeks ago, did suggest that the French strategic deterrent could be extended to Europe, perhaps. And what he has triggered is a very vigorous debate within Europe about what that would look like, what an amplified European military defense could and should look like, and what role nuclear weapons could play in that. Let me just touch briefly then on the two countries where this has been most prominently discussed, and that's in Germany and in Poland. Even in Germany, people have suggested that the time may have come for Germany to consider developing its own nuclear weapons. And this would be a monumental change in global strategic calculations. Any decision in that regard is still, I think, some distance off. In Poland, Polish leadership, including Donald Tusk, the prime minister, has raised recently and hinted at this before, that providing Poland with some role in the nuclear deterrence structure should be considered and possibly done. That could take two forms. It could take the form of the U.S. deploying nuclear capable forces, air forces it would be, and most likely to Poland, or to involve Poland in a nuclear sharing program that we have done and led in NATO for many, many years, wherein Poland would have a nuclear delivery capability, but the U.S. would provide the nuclear weapons that could be delivered. What we have going on right now is a large, large debate in Europe about both the U.S. nuclear commitment to Europe and what it should do both in conventional weapons and now in nuclear weapons. Even in Poland, there has been some discussion about Poland beginning to think about developing its own nuclear weapons. The real point is the reverberations that would happen if any steps like this were taken in Europe. And that's what we don't know. There are three things I can think in the near term, at least, that Donald Trump could do. One, he could work to restore extended deterrence. This would be most applicable in Europe, but also in Asia. The NATO summit in July, which will take place, will be an extremely important event for dealing with these issues. The second thing I would say that Trump could do is to align himself with Russia and China more closely on Iran. China and Russia have gotten together on how to deal with the Iranian threat of moving to a nuclear capability. Trump could position himself in circumstances that may emerge to work with both of those countries when together they could apply much greater pressure on Iran than they could do separately or even when only two of them are doing it. And finally, as a step that Trump could do that would have an impact on proliferation is to resurrect arms control. He's talked about this. Keith alluded to some of his remarks about denuclearization and even getting rid of nuclear weapons. He's thinking in ways that have precedence, but would be a major change.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a thought on that. I think that the doubt of the extent of the U.S. nuclear deterrent or any nuclear deterrent really resides in the minds of those looking at the United States and other nuclear powers. And the suspicion that if they were attacked on their own soil, they would not honor commitments to protect other non-nuclear powers. I think that's the root of the problem. So I think that there are a lot of things that you could do to calm people around the world, but I don't think you would make them confident again in the willingness of a major nuclear power, in effect, to commit suicide to come to their rescue. It will not be, in my view, until we have an effective anti-ballistic missile system that this equation is going to be seriously changed.
Excellent. Thank you, Rae. I'm going to stump you with this one. Foreign policy is very closely tied to nuclear issues. So who should be in charge of that foreign policy? Should it be an elected president here or somewhere else, an autocrat? Or should nuclear policy issues be really handled in the realm of professionals, whether those are foreign policy experts and with nuclear expertise or with nuclear experts? Who should be in charge of nuclear global foreign policy in the United States and globally? Go for it, Rae.
In my view, you need both. The man in charge is the president, and there should be no doubt about that. But he needs experts to do a number of things. They have to go find out what the situation is in various countries and where there is a rising threat or a threat extent. They've got to tell him what he is facing in terms of trying to bargain away the other side. What's the balance of political powers on the other side? And what does he have that he can offer to slow down proliferation? It takes the president to direct the policy, but he needs a lot of help.
He needs also accountability within the executive branch. He needs to have good advisors, military and political, and Department of Energy nuclear advisors. And he needs to have good, solid congressional oversight And this is one of the things I think we have lost recently. I think we have lost a lot of good people in the Senate and the House who hold the executive branch accountable. In a good sense, we have the structure for reasonable accountability and to make good decisions. We just have to get the right people in the position and make sure that they stand up to each other and hold each other accountable.
Maureen, let me just add one quick thing, which is to agree with both Ray and Keith, but only to emphasize the critical importance on nuclear policy of the president. Of course, he's got to have top expertise to help him. And Keith's point on working with Congress is also critically important. But when we look back at our history, where we have been most successful on these issues is when we have had the benefit of strong presidential leadership, because nuclear weapons are unique and like nothing else.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to really reflect from your perspective. And Tom, I'm going to have you speak first from the nuclear non-proliferation perspective. What is it that we're most concerned about? Is it expertise? Is it materials? Is it designs? Is it regional instability? What is it as a nuclear non-proliferation expert that you are most concerned about?
I believe we're faced with the inevitability of nuclear proliferation. That doesn't mean necessarily the proliferation of nuclear weapons per se, but more the proliferation of the application of nuclear technologies. One of the things that has been left out, I think, so far in our discussion, in particular with regards to global considerations, is the economic dimension. You will not prevent nuclear proliferation given its efficiency for producing energy to the benefit of people, of industries, of commerce, of transportation, etc., without addressing the economic disparities that will drive the nations that don't have nuclear power right now to want to get it and to use it. And so I would say that the policy issues have to include the economic dimension, not just the technical and not just the political.
Excellent. Thanks. Keith, I'm going to bounce to you. What are you most worried about? Is it the development of a nuclear program in Iran? Is it Ukraine restoring and building their own nuclear capabilities? They certainly have materials. Is it North Korea? Is it China? What is it when you look out from a global state actor perspective that concerns you most?
I have three nightmare scenarios. One is Iran getting nuclear weapons. At least the current regime in Tehran, unless it changes its stripes, which is not likely, is also a significant supporter of terrorism. And it has its people in the Middle East and so on. It's trying to support and encourage against Israel and to some degree against the US. So that's the most immediate threat. North Korea is Kim stable? Is he more concerned about survivability or is he concerned about wreaking havoc in his neighborhood? That's an unknown to me. The third thing is Pakistan. You have an Islamic country that's under tremendous pressure from the radicals to not work closely with the US and other Western countries. It has always been conflicted, and unfortunately, the US has not always been a reliable partner for it. It helped us tremendously against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And when we detected that Pakistan was working on its nuclear program, we then decided not to give it its F-16s that it wanted as penalty. And so my concern is that the radicals, should they get control of Islamabad and Pakistan policy, we could have a whole nother source of instability and the potential passing of nuclear stuff to all kinds of radical people who would make our life pretty miserable.
On that cheery note, John, can you give us a quick look at, is there a future for nuclear arms treaties?
I hope so. And I think there is a future for that. In the first instance, it needs to develop with Russia, the United States, and China. I think that will have a strong impact on the proliferation outlook. But what I would urge is that our country, our leadership, our policymakers think hard about what you can do to prevent what might otherwise some people think is inevitable. I think if you move down a pathway of inevitability, it cramps your ability to think about what to do that might put you in a better position strategically from the standpoint of stability.
Thank you. And before we close, Rae, I was going to give you the last word, but I'm not. I'm going to give you the last clap because I understand that it is your 90th birthday coming up, and Keith ratted you out. So happy birthday, my dear friend. May we all be this nimble and on top of issues as you are when we turn 90. Thank you very much. So with that, thank you very much. I will see you in April, and we appreciate everybody being here.